You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, we've got some breaking news here. Donald Trump has been fighting in court to amend his gag order in his New York criminal trial that we're awaiting sentencing for, and of course that will happen on July 11th. But we have an update here. Can you speak on what just happened?
Yeah, Brian, 2/3 of the existing gag order have been terminated. And, it's alarming when you see that the gag order that Judge Merchan had put in place to protect witnesses against Donald Trump's reckless and violence-inducing rhetoric, jurors in the case, and court staff and prosecutors and their staff and family members, when you hear that 2/3 of it have just been terminated, you kind of recoil in horror, because it would be nice if the criminal justice system would forever put a stop to Donald Trump endangering the people who are involved in the endeavor of trying to hold him accountable for his crimes. But here is specifically what Judge Merchan did on a motion from the defense. They wanted the entire gag order terminated because the purpose of the gag order was to protect the integrity of the proceedings, right? Protect and preserve the due administration of justice. And essentially that meant to protect the ability of the people and the prosecutors to get a fair trial through verdict. Well, as we now know, a verdict has been entered. The jury found Donald Trump guilty of 34 counts of felony falsifying business records to try to steal the 2016 election. So the trial proper is over. All that's left is the sentencing. So the defense said, we want the entire gag order thrown out. The judge said, here's what I'm going to do. I am going to terminate the gag order as it applied to you not being able to talk about the witnesses. Why? Because, the witnesses were entitled to testify without being harassed and badgered and bullied and put in danger by you, Mr. Defendant, Donald Trump. So he terminated that portion of it. Interestingly, Brian, he terminated it without the prosecutors objecting. They acknowledged that now that the jury trial is over, there no longer exists the same basis that prompted Judge Merchan to issue the gag order regarding witnesses in the first place. The other part that he modified and actually terminated was with respect to jurors. The prosecutors also did not object to this. They said, because the trial proper is over and the jury service is complete, we no longer think there is the same legal basis to keep the gag order in place regarding Donald Trump's ability to talk about the jurors who decided the case. So Judge Merchan terminated that 1/3 of the gag order. But Judge Merchan, in his 5-page ruling, said, I still have great concern for the safety of the jurors. So I will keep in place my pre-trial order that said the names, the identities, the information about the jurors will remain private and sealed and secret, and it is not to be disseminated. So he kind of split the gag order baby there a little bit. And then the following 1/3 is the part of the gag order that he kept in place, and the prosecutors asked him to keep it in place. And that is with respect to Donald Trump not being able to harass, intimidate, threaten, or inspire others to do so regarding the court staff and family members and the prosecutors and family members. That piece, Judge Merchan said, I will keep in place until the conclusion of the trial proper, which will be July 11th, the sentencing date. And at that point, at least inferentially, that 1/3 piece of the gag order will be terminated as well. So, Brian, it's a little disturbing to realize that Donald Trump is now free to harass and intimidate and potentially threaten the witnesses who testified against him. Of course, here is the silver lining behind the big orange dark cloud that is Donald Trump. If he does something that constitutes a threat against a witness or retaliation against a witness for the fact that they testified against him, that could easily be the basis of new criminal charges against Donald Trump, notwithstanding that the gag order no longer exists. So I'm sure the New York authorities will continue to monitor everything Donald Trump says and does and posts to see if he commits any new crimes against witnesses, jurors, or anybody else.
But let me ask you one more question, because I think this is especially important. Yes, the gag order has been lifted, but if Judge Merchan hears Donald Trump, go balls to the wall basically and just attack Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen relentlessly, could that factor in terms of the utter lack of remorse that Donald Trump is showing ahead of sentencing in this trial?
I am so glad you asked that question, because I had made a mental note to myself to make the point that Donald Trump will immediately, he's probably already got those tiny little fingers on Truth Social, threatening Michael Cohen, Stormy Daniels, and goodness knows who else. That is absolutely relevant come sentencing time on July 11th. And I don't want to hope that he begins threatening people, because I don't want the witnesses who did the hard work of dangerous work of holding Donald Trump accountable for his crimes be put in harm's way anew. But I suspect they will be, and it will absolutely be relevant when sentencing day rolls round on the question of the danger that Donald Trump poses to others, because the dangerousness of the convicted offender is absolutely relevant to the sentencing determination.
If these people can bring forward a new criminal case against Donald Trump, if he intimidates them, for example, why not just keep the gag order in place? Like, what was the point of eliminating the gag order because we'd reached verdict and not sentencing, when, we'd spoken in the past about how often these gag orders are in place throughout the entirety of the duration of this trial?
It's frustrating, but I actually think it was the right legal call by Judge Merchan, because the basis of the gag order with respect to witnesses and jurors was to preserve the integrity of the trial in as much as it involved witnesses and jurors. The trial no longer involves witnesses and jurors. So at most, he could have perhaps kept it in place until July 11th. But Brian, that actually would have undercut the basis for his decision in the first instance. While their service was ongoing in the case, both the witnesses and the jurors, that's when they needed to be protected. And, that's when the sort of balance between a defendant's constitutional rights to say whatever he wants and the judge's obligation to preserve the integrity of the proceedings gets struck in a different way. So, again, as frustrating as it is, I think it was probably the right legal call. And the only thing that remains in place is now to protect the people who are still actively involved in the case. That would be the court staff and the prosecutor's office.
Legal implications aside, it does seem like the only reason to do this is expressly to allow Donald Trump to attack witnesses in this case. What do you think the political benefit to him is going to be by virtue of allowing him to just go after Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels and other people that were involved in this case?
I would love to hear your opinion, Brian. You're the political expert, on what you think the political benefit might be. Let me talk about the legal implications. First of all, as I've already said, I tend to agree, even though it's sort of horrifying, I tend to agree with the legal basis for Judge Merchan's ruling. But let me take a crack at what I think the political implications are, but you're going to be the voice of authority on that. I think, anytime he attacks people, particularly people that he perceives as his enemies, and accordingly, Donald Trump's base then kind of, just laps up whatever Donald Trump is pouring out to them. And so maybe when he attacks his enemies and perceived enemies, it makes his base feel good. So, of course, they want to please their dear leader, their orange deity, and they do the same. They lash out at witnesses and others who have done Donald Trump wrong in Donald Trump's opinion. So I don't know. It certainly doesn't expand Donald Trump's base, but it
Right.
continues to feed them, I think, what he's been feeding them all along. And given that they really are, in effect, cult members, they just lap it up. So I don't, but here's the other thing. Even if it would tend to hurt him politically, Brian, my take is Donald Trump actually cares far less about the political implications of retaliating against his enemies, and he cares far more about just retaliating against his enemies, because that is who he is.
I would say in terms of the political implications, as we know, nothing could ever be Donald Trump's fault. And so the fact that he was prosecuted and convicted on 34 felony counts, that needs to be blamed on somebody else. And so in this case, for example, he's pointing at everybody involved, but he can't actually name the prosecutors, the judge, or their families right now. So he has to settle for just pointing the finger at Michael Cohen, at Stormy Daniels, how they were part of this whole coup against him. And so I think that giving him the opportunity to now name these people will again put a name to a face in terms of who Donald Trump can blame and allow him to wallow in victimhood. That's how he views himself throughout the entirety of this process. Nothing is ever his fault, and so he always needs somebody to point the finger at. Freeing up Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels as like somebody else who's to blame in all of this, or just impugning their character and making them part of the democratic machine, the communist Marxist democratic machine that took him down, is exactly what he needs to do. Because if he can't speak about these people, if he can't name them, then who's he going to point the finger at? Who's he going to wallow in victimhood by blaming? Who's going to scapegoat? And so he needs these people to be able to, allow him and his supporters to lash out at somebody, because as we all know, nothing could ever be his fault. There is also the fact that Donald Trump is fueled solely by his desire for retribution. Gone are the days of 2016 Trump where he's pretending to be a populist and claiming that he's going to have a healthcare plan that's going to be cheaper for everybody and more comprehensive for everybody. Gone are the days of him promising a middle-class tax cut. Gone are the days of him promising infrastructure or lower costs or more jobs. He is fueled solely by his desire, his undying desire for revenge against his enemies. And I think this is actually to his political disadvantage here, but because he can only think in terms of his own ego, he's going to blame these people and rail against these people who, to your earlier point, is going to help feed his base. But running a campaign predicated on getting retribution against your enemies is not going to expand your tent. It's not going to bring new voters in. There's no independents out there who are deciding between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, but Donald Trump promised to attack people who he didn't like harder. And so that's going to win over their vote when they're worried about whether they can afford healthcare or groceries that month. So I think this is ultimately going to hurt him because he has no self-control, and he's going to immediately revert back to his id and start attacking people because that's the mode that he has right now. And so I think, ultimately at the end of the day, we might perceive this as a win for Trump because, Judge Merchan scaled back on this gag order by 2/3, and that was a motion that was being pushed by Donald Trump's own lawyers. But I think this kind of stuff is going to bite him because when you free up Donald Trump to attack his perceived enemies, that's exactly what he's going to do, and he's going to do it at the expense of everything else. And none of what he's railing against here, by virtue of attacking his enemies, is a winning message for the American people as we head toward November.
Yeah, Brian, and I'm happy to hear you say that, it will probably hurt him politically. I agree that nothing he has said or done in, I would say, the last several years, to my way of thinking, has attracted new supporters to his cause. But, I think both of us have seen over time people peeling away, from Donald Trump for any number of reasons. The more they hear how dangerous and violent and revenge-driven he is, I think they've been peeling away, maybe only in ones and twos and sixes, but they are peeling away. And listen, for the good of democracy, let's hope that is a trend that continues. But here's the thing. If I were Michael Cohen, if I were Stormy Daniels, boy, I would not sleep well tonight because now Donald Trump has been unleashed on them anew by virtue of this gag order being lifted. I don't know that there are any other existing gag orders or conditions of release that are in place in his other cases that might help give the Michael Cohens and the Stormy Daniels of this episode any protection.
All right, well, we will, of course, stay on top of this, and, we'll mark down any instances where Donald Trump, of course, now newly unleashed, is allowed to attack Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen because, if Judge Merchan takes this into account when sentencing rolls around in 2 weeks from now, this is going to play a big role, and Donald Trump might think he scored a victory here by virtue of the gag order being lifted mostly, but I think at the end of the day, this is just going to ultimately redound to his political and legal disadvantage here. So we will, of course, stay on top of this. For those watching right now, if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe to both of our channels. The links are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.